It seems that almost every profession, every discipline, at some point, runs into some difficulties. And mindfulness is no exception. Hi. If you've been here before, welcome back. Good to see you again, and thanks for returning. For those of you who are new to this video podcast, my name is Ted Meissner. I'm a senior mindfulness teacher, and I'll have a whole different episode on what that means, but for now, just know that I've had a lot of training, been doing this for a long time, and continue to receive and give supervision on mindfulness. Within this field, there are some tensions that have occurred and continue to occur. I actually consider that to be a good thing because it shows that this is a lively discipline that's taking a look after itself. Fortunately, some experts in the field I've talked with other experts in the field about what they've been running into, and a recent paper was published about tensions within mindfulness, at least as of this recording, a few of them. We are very fortunate today that we have 3 guests from that paper from the University of Bath to share with us what they found. Come on, let's meet some new friends. Hi, everyone. Our guests today from the University of Bath Center for Mindfulness and Community are Dr. Liz Marks. Hi, Liz.
Hi.
Masha Remskar, welcome. Good to see you.
Hello, Ted. Thank you for having us.
And Tom Jenkins. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Ted. Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you all so much for being here. And as I was mentioning just before we started recording, for those who are watching this now, this is so well timed, our conversation today, because just yesterday, as of this recording, there was a gathering of over 200 teachers of mindfulness across the world that the European Association for Mindfulness-Based Approaches, EAMBA, held. And many of the things that were discussed in that conversation were ones that you had brought up in your paper that we're going to be talking today. So just very, very well timed. And one of the things I'd first like to ask is this particular paper about some of the tensions that are occurring right now. What drew you to this particular topic? What made this very interesting just for you and what you have seen? Liz, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. It's a great question. As a mindfulness center, there's quite a few of us working together, and we're sort of united by our interests in mindfulness. And also in community and building community and the aspects in which mindfulness and compassion and kindness can be pulled together. So we really thought it'd be lovely for us all to get together and think about our different aspects of work and what that's brought up for us in terms of developing our thinking, the questions that we struggle with or that we like asking ourselves. So it was a really lovely process where about 10 or 12 of us got together and we had some really interesting conversations, and we got to think about what are the most pressing matters in our research or our practice that we really wanted to explore. And that was kind of, I guess, the seed for it. And then out of that came the things that we thought were most important.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. It's so interesting to hear the idea of, we brought a bunch of people together to get a lot of different perspectives included. Thank you for that. Masha, how about for you? What was that was interesting for you in coming to this particular piece?
Yeah, I really loved the whole process. And I think what for me was particularly great was how kind of organic it all was. So we didn't, in a lot of ways, a lot of the points that we were talking about were already kind of we'd come across in our day-to-day conversation in center meetings when, say, one of us were trying to design a study and the way we were approaching or defining mindfulness or measuring it was so different to someone else who's working in a different population or a different kind of, with different methods. So I think really taking that organic, some of the tensions that we'd all come across before and almost like formalizing them and putting them down on paper, that was really, really great, in my opinion. And that's what made the paper hopefully relatable to other people researching mindfulness as well.
Yeah, and it is very relatable. And yes, you bring up a very good point. Even our definitions of mindfulness may vary, based on the cohorts we're working with, the programs that we're using, whatever it happens to be. Thank you for that. Tom, how about for you? What was it that drew you to this particular work?
Yeah, no, I echo a lot of what Marsha and Liz were saying with that. I think it was really nice to get together as a centre and bring together all of our interests, because we are quite diverse with the way we look at mindfulness. And it was a really enjoyable paper to write, because I think we kind of got together in this big room, and then, you know, we had all these big discussions about, you know, what are these tensions, and people really, you know, it really connected us, and it really made us think actually a lot of this stuff is, you know, we're already working through this, and whether that's, you know, in personal practice or in research as well. So yeah, I think it was nice to bring some of the things we observe in life and research in the world into something collaborative that we could all work together on.
Yeah, and again, that's another piece to this that is so wonderful, is how very collaborative it was, particularly in the very beginnings, to invite those perspectives that might not be things any one of us on our own would have thought of. So thank you for just that very structure. I think it's a wonderful way to approach it. So in the paper itself, you mention 4 key tensions. And I'm not going to test you on memorizing them. I'm going to read them here, and then we'll delve into each one. The first is mindfulness for me versus mindfulness for others, mindfulness for some versus mindfulness for all, the whole versus the sum of its parts, and improving access versus preserving fidelity. And each one of those, I think, could be its own paper and rich topic of discussion. So we're just going to delve in a little bit on each of those. And I'm wondering if we might start with, was there any particular one of those that was most interesting to you, or what you learned the most from? Which of those might it be? Masha, I wonder if we could start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I think the one I probably connected to the most, or the one that I maybe had the most to say from my own research about, was the one about mindfulness as a whole versus a sum of its parts, or kind of that tension there, where, you know, mindfulness traditionally will have been a very complex, holistic practice or set of practices, or even an ideology or a lifestyle. And a lot of those kind of parts of mindfulness have since been picked apart, or maybe tried to be studied separately, delivered separately. And I think there inherently is that tension, because as scientists in particular, we're often so keen to know, what is it about this that works? Who does it work for? What, you know, if we tweak this component, or if we do this differently, what does that change? So I think that was something that, with mindfulness in particular, is so very interesting. And that really we could have really interesting conversations, again, within the center, because we approach it differently and because we study it differently. So yeah, that mindfulness as a whole versus some elements or parts of mindfulness, that was a really, really interesting discussion for me.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to think about the wonderful, honestly, complexities of what's involved with mindfulness. That's not just one thing, there are many aspects to it. And of course, that ongoing challenge in the sciences in general, if we remove a part, is it still the same thing as when it's part of a functioning, dynamic ecosystem of whatever it happens to be? Thank you, Masha. Tom, how about for you? Which one of those was the one that brought the most interest or fascination?
Yeah, so for me, the one that I think most of my research was related to was the one mindfulness for some versus mindfulness for all, and it's sort of really speaking to this tension of, like, why is mindfulness more appealing to some people than others? And I think appealing is like quite a broad term there, because for some, the idea of mindfulness is more appealing to, you know, to some people more than others. We were speaking just before about how, you know, sometimes at the beginning of mindfulness, my own experience was that I was initially very interested in the idea before I'd even practiced it. I'd heard stories about it, and that really led me towards practice. Whereas for other people, they might hear the idea and instantly be put off and think, oh, it's, you know, it's not for me. It's for, you know, a culture of people that I don't belong to, or I don't, you know, fit in with that idea of spirituality or whatever the association. So I think it's interesting to think about why are certain people drawn to the practice, but then also when people begin to practice, why do some people, you know, find it really boring and fall asleep, and why do other people find it really enlightening and profound, and what sort of anchors people to that journey as well. You know, you can have a 10-minute sit and it can be, you know, really boring, and you can realize that your knee really hurts and think, oh, I don't want to do this again. Or you can have that same experience and think, oh, there's something to this. Like, you know, I saw that I was thinking lots, and I saw that I was creating a lot of misery for myself. So yeah, why do people, you know, some people have that experience and stick to the path of mindfulness, and why for some people do they think, you know, this is not for me? So I particularly find that tension quite interesting. And yeah, that's I also think the tension about me versus others is super interesting, because, you know, it's looking at bringing mindfulness, sort of looking at dislocation from mindfulness's spiritual roots. But yeah, those two.
Yeah, as you're speaking of this, it's putting me in mind of wondering how people work with their cognitive dissonance when they're approaching something new like mindfulness, and finding, oh, parts of this aren't quite feeling right, other parts are amazing. And what is the choice there? Is that oh, this isn't for me, and I'm done? Or is it something where, yeah, there's still something here, and I'm going to stick with this, and what's that journey like, and finding the right spot that is helpful to them with whatever they're doing, and not necessarily easy, maybe the most challenging work, but the one that might be most helpful, whatever that is. Thank you. Liz, how about for you? Which one of these was the most interesting for you?
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I think it was mindfulness for me versus mindfulness for others. And it speaks quite strongly to my broader area of research, which is around planetary health, the impacts of climate change and the ecological crises on people psychologically and in terms of their mental health and well-being, which I think points towards the fact that what we're now facing today as individuals is what we're facing today as a global community, and how that creates a need for us to be able to think about collective responses, and taking care of each other, and taking care of the planet as well. And I think this, I think that mindfulness can have incredible power for individuals in terms of helping them to helping people to live well, to manage difficulties with mental health, like we see in, you know, MBCT for depression, for example, is very effective. But I also think that mindfulness comes from a root where it's traditionally practiced in community and was inextricable from its ethical roots. I mean, there are also spiritual elements to it as well, which I think is really interesting to think about in terms of how we think about our place in the world at this time of crisis. But I do think that idea of the ethical roots of mindfulness are really important. And that actually maybe we don't need to separate mindfulness for me versus mindfulness for others, because we know that an individual is their well-being is shaped by the context in which they live and all the other people around them. So I was really interested in looking into that a little bit more. And there's been some really interesting studies around, for example, people who practice mindfulness and how that relates to pro-environmental behavior. Pro-social behavior. I'm looking at pro-environmental behavior at the moment in a research project. So there is this idea that mindfulness itself can lead people to be more engaged with others around them, which speaks to that idea that it's not just for me. And I think some of the other research that I've done particularly around the qualitative work of people in the MBCT groups. I did some work with people who did MBCT for tinnitus. And one of the strong themes coming out of what they benefited from the group, and you see it in other qualitative studies of mindfulness interventions in groups, is the power of the group, the power of the collective, and how that supports motivation and learning and well-being. So I think those ideas are really interesting. And also developing on from that, I think some of the second generation MBIs that are in development now talk about ideas like impermanence and interconnection, and using these kind of philosophical ways of looking at the world as approaches that might benefit people's mental health and well-being. But I also think there's something really useful there about how that way of looking at the world can support us in thinking about how we relate to the crises we're living through, and whether there might be some value in helping people develop that. So, for example, understanding myself as being conditioned by the world around me and deeply interconnected with everything around me maybe has the ability to help me shift my perspective from being very self-focused to looking more at the world and the community.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, because it brings up such an important part that anyone who has taught mindfulness in particularly large heavyweight programs that have a big commitment with a group understand that that's a very different experience than I've downloaded an app and on my own I'm going to pick, a different meditation to listen to, and that reminds me of being a child and mixing some of my favorite ingredients in the kitchen together, and boy, it doesn't work when you put all of those together. And it's having a group, having not just the validation of being with others who may be in a similar situation or share things that, oh, I can connect with that too. Yeah, I get that. Is that it's broader than that. There's more to it than that. And this is one of the risks that I see with folks who think that mindfulness is a technique that is a 10-minute app I do on my own for myself, severed from a group, severed from that interdependence, severed from all the rest of the things that you just mentioned, Liz, as tremendous values to mindfulness. Thank you so much for that.
And so, yet, if I may just jump in there to not neglect the final tension that we've not yet covered, that you've actually just brought up there, of that dilemma between, how do we preserve the integrity of mindfulness and the kind of ancient complex practice versus how do we actually bring it to more and more people? How can it help benefit more people? And how can we offer it in other ways, in other formats perhaps? And a number of us in the center actually work with digital mindfulness quite a lot, including myself, and that does include apps as well. So while there are definitely very worthwhile conversations to be had there, I do think as researchers striving to be more and more inclusive, and to improve accessibility and scalability of anything that we do, I do think it's important to at least give those types of resources a space, even though they can be prefaced with all sorts of kind of caveats, or we can even classify as almost different, a different category of resource to maybe a full-on 8-week MBSR course in a group in person, or a silent retreat. They are very, very different, and they'll have different processes through which they work. But I do also think, that inherent tension of how do we improve accessibility versus conserve or preserve all of that richness of traditional mindfulness, that is why we included that final tension as well. And again, that has come directly from our own work, where we have got those dilemmas on the daily.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because it is such an important aspect that these have their own place and way to connect with people. That 10-minute app may be the only way in which someone might connect with mindfulness at all, and that may be enough for them, and that it doesn't have to be now you must do this other stuff. It's not a funnel. It doesn't have to be that way. And the fidelity piece is so fascinating because I also have worked at an app company that does mindfulness, and am reviewing updates to the MBSR curriculum that have been proposed by individuals in a university here in the US. And so that fidelity is understanding, well, what are we maintaining fidelity to? For some, if the fidelity is not this very specific form of a traditional view of what mindfulness is, then it's no good and it's wrong. And for others, it's, well, what's a fidelity to with different characteristics of mindfulness that may help with a particular difficulty that people are running into? Tinnitus, for example, and I have a number of people who take my classes like, I have this and it's been really hard to do it. Well, conveniently, there's research showing that mindfulness can be helpful with this. And it may be a different kind than we've been doing here in this very accessible program that's an 8-week program, but only half an hour long, and is online and has hundreds of people in it all together. So yeah, very interesting to explore this topic. That is, we will never be bored talking about the fidelity stuff. Thank you, Masha, for bringing that up. So based on the work in putting this together, your conversations with each other, with others involved with it, the research you've been doing, the papers that you've reviewed to contribute to this work, I'm curious to hear from each of you on some of the things that have come up for you about why this is important, or some things that you'd like to see occur within the field of mindfulness in the coming years that we might not be doing so well today. Tom, how about for you? Let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think around, I guess with the tension I spoke about, mindfulness for some versus mindfulness for all, I'd be really curious to see more and more research on sort of individual differences and individual responses to mindfulness, and that there already is some work. And yeah, I'd just be really curious to sort of see what is it, what is it about somebody that would draw them towards it? What is it for somebody that enables and facilitates practice, and actually what is it for people that pushes them away, and why are people just put off the idea altogether? And sometimes thinking about, like, is mindfulness something that people would do if it wasn't offered to them? I think, Marsha, you spoke about earlier, sorry, just before we were meeting, that you were once a participant in a research trial, and then you've continued the practice. And I really loved hearing that, because do people want to participate in research because it's research and because they're interested, or because there's other incentives involved? But then what makes somebody make this into a lifestyle and into a habit? And why would somebody choose to go on a retreat, for example, or become more and more entwined with mindfulness? So that I find really interesting. And I'd be I'm always interested to hear about sort of like follow-ups and like longitudinal studies, and what happens after the 8 weeks, what happens after the MBSR, and do people carry on going with it? And so I'd love, and I know it's really difficult to do from a research point of view, but I'd love to see more and more like longer term studies and or even just check-ins and follow-ups of people, 12 months time, 24 months time, do you still practice? I'd be interested to see how that develops personally.
Thank you, Tom. And this reminds me of Cliff Saren's work at the Shamatha Project, which is a longitudinal study that's been going on for decades on people's practice and what that's like. And there aren't a lot of other projects doing that have that kind of sustainability. Thank you. Liz, how about for you? What are some of the things that you would like to see in mindfulness in the future that we might not have now, or just your thoughts on where we're going?
Yeah, I think just again, I might focus on the tension I talked about, because that's probably where my heart lies. I'm really interested in some of the broader aspects that might relate to mindfulness. So one example would be the types of practices that are included in mindfulness training, and there are a number of specific. So in MBCT, you've got the body scan, you've got focusing on the breath, you've got mindful movement, sitting with difficulty, those kind of things. But there are so many potential mindfulness practices out there that focus on kind of developing slightly different states. So, for example, the noble states, such as loving kindness or friendliness, gratitude or joy, compassion, and equanimity, for example. And these kind of practices are sort of focused on developing well-being and qualities of the self that can be really nourishing, and that go a bit further beyond some of the other things that MBCT, for example, might focus on, around ways of not getting so caught up in thinking, ways of responding to difficult feelings or thoughts. And I know, so for example, in our MBCT for tinnitus course, we included a loving kindness practice that people found really helpful. And of course, there's a whole field of compassion focused work, like compassion focused therapy, which uses kind of some practices that are developing that, and it is based on being able to be a bit mindful in the beginning. You've got your soothing breathing rhythm and things. So there's so many overlaps. And I just think and it overlaps, of course, with the kind of the field of positive psychology as well. So I think kind of being able to draw in the findings from that and understand how developing these types of states through meditative or contemplative practice would be really interesting. So that's one thing. And I think the other side of that, which I'm quite interested in, and is as I was alluding to, the maybe some of the philosophical standpoints or the ways of looking at the world. So how does it affect us and our mental health and well-being if we really deeply appreciate impermanence, and that things are always changing? You know, if you ask anyone, do things change all the time? They say, yeah, of course they do. But to really appreciate that and to meditate on it perhaps gives one a little bit of space around not being so caught up in really painful states, with the knowledge that they will pass. And I spoke before a little bit about how I think interconnection might help benefit people and loosen that tightness, that sense of self that can fuel distress as well. So I think just that development that you're already seeing happening, either in second generation mindfulness-based interventions or other areas of psychology and mental health, I think bringing that together would be great.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of the interesting things is that while many of these ways of looking at them, the structure of them, generally speaking, may come from a traditional setting, doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us as human beings today. Mm-hmm. That the wisdom comes from that structure describing what human experience is like. So things like impermanence and interconnectedness and those abodes you were speaking about before are part of what we may encounter each day in our lives, and having some intentional attention to those can make a very big difference. A mindful engagement with distress, a mindful engagement with compassion. I know of at least 3 different full compassion mindfulness programs where that's the only topic we go into. So yeah, again, a very rich field. Thank you, Liz.
And I guess just one thing to say, because I'm probably framing it from a Buddhist perspective, you know, the words I've been using and the way I've been framing it. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that many of these ideas exist across a range of spiritual traditions. And so something I think that's going to be also really important, I'd like to see more of, is making it culturally relevant, and spiritually relevant to a whole range of people, that inclusivity nature as well.
Yeah, and this brings the entire area, and something that this podcast focuses on is the diversity, and that it's not just all from one thing. That's not what we're doing here, that this applies to people, and we need to be aware of things like cultural appropriation, cultural appropriateness for the groups involved, what is going to be most helpful to them in the circumstances that they're in. And that's going to be different, even with the same cultural group. It's not monolithic. There are divisions there too. And that's something that brings strength to it, because each one of those is a unique perspective that increases their territory of understanding. Totally agree. Thank you, Liz. Masha, how about for you?
I've just had a nice little break to think about this. So I think my hopes and my kind of vision for the field is twofold. One, what have all just kind of alluded to, is that increase in diversity in how do we bring mindfulness to communities, and how do we create mindfulness type practices for communities that maybe are currently not reached by it, either in terms of research. So, how do we include people in our research that might otherwise not be kind of immediately inclined to participate or to kind of practice something like mindfulness? And then that might be in a number of different ways. So, for example, in terms of kind of cultural diversity, we've got a doctoral researcher in our own center, Iman Al-Beda. She is working on how we can tailor mindfulness for Muslim and Arab communities, and her work is incredibly important. So that, for example, is one way. How do we culturally bring mindfulness closer to some communities? And then, for example, another group or a type of kind of shift that I'd like to see is how do we maybe bring mindfulness into more male heavy spaces? So if we look at kind of the research base at the moment, the majority of research is done on, a relatively homogenous sample, and men in particular seem to be a group that are quite hard to reach. Perhaps because of some of the language around mindfulness, perhaps because of the way, maybe some of the stereotypes of who is the kind of person that practices mindfulness. I found some of these kind of hints at this resistance in some of my own qualitative work, and it's something I'm really hoping to look into further. So how we can reach groups that we are currently not reaching. And then my second kind of hope for how mindfulness as a field can develop a bit more is the potential of mindfulness practice and mindfulness training for kind of its spillover into other areas of our life. So I'm myself looking into the potential of mindfulness for behavior change outcomes, and then again as a spillover for mental health and well-being as well. But for example, we know that mindfulness and people who are more mindful as a personality characteristic, so trait mindfulness, that tends to correlate with people being generally healthier and doing more health behaviors. So for example, doing more exercise, spending more time outdoors, that kind of thing. And I think by now we have established quite well that mindfulness can help mental health, well-being, a range of physical and mental conditions. But I really hope that we turn to and kind of look at how we can maybe use mindfulness as a skill and develop that skill and try and help other areas of maybe health and community life and that kind of thing as well. So those would be my two main ones that I'm really hoping to see and contribute to myself.
Thank you. And again, such a rich territory for exploration is this idea of how does mindfulness get presented to a particular demographic, to put it in scientific terms, that's not, you do it our way, you do it your way. And that learning, so you brought up a researcher who's finding ways to make this something that is accessible to those in a particular cohort, in a particular area, who have a shared experience that any one of us on screen here right now will not. And it's not about you do it my way. No. What is your way of engaging with this practice and still maintain some fidelity to how it is as human beings? What are we seeing based on research and understanding of just human neurobiology? So again, we'll never be bored. Okay. One final question. If you were catching up with an old friend, a family member, and they'd heard about this particular paper, and there was just one thing you really wanted to share with someone who hadn't read it, didn't really understand what it was about, what would be one thing that you would want to talk with them about this? Liz, I'm wondering if we could start with you on this one.
You said there wouldn't be any difficult questions, Ted. I mean, I'll probably circle back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is that mindfulness practice. So I'm assuming they know a little bit about mindfulness. Mindfulness practice can incorporate a huge range of experiences, and it's a very rich thing that someone can delve into. And that when thinking about mindfulness and reading about it, remembering that it's got a broad range of effects too, that it can be really helpful for the individual, but that also built into the very process, the fabric of mindfulness, is a sense of care and compassion for others as well. And that in practicing mindfulness, if you're practicing mindfulness, you're practicing for yourself and for other beings. That's probably my take-home point.
Thank you, Liz. And Masha, how about for you?
I think what this particular paper illustrates really well for me is it's almost slightly more meta, slightly kind of goes beyond mindfulness itself. But I think it illustrates the process of the scientific inquiry and that kind of process of how we as researchers, and maybe particularly as mindfulness researchers, are constantly evaluating ourselves, our work, how the field is developing, how does our own individual work contribute, or our center's work contribute to kind of the very broad literature base? What can we do better? And it really, I think, is this beautiful demonstration of how, both as a mindfulness field and as scientists, we are just constantly trying to, be critical, but also accepting, and maybe to bring some mindfulness into it, of what's going on, how we can improve. So I think this beautiful demonstration of how the scientific process works, and works for good, hopefully. And that is obviously what we're all trying to do, both as mindfulness researchers and as kind of, you as a mindfulness communicator, and everyone here, basically, we're all just trying to leave the world a tiny bit better than we found it.
Thank you very much. Well said. Tom, how about for you?
They were two really good answers. I agree. I agree with both of those. And yeah, I think maybe, if the person's never tried mindfulness, it would be really like expressing that mindfulness experiences can, be on a spectrum, and we can have very, limited practice with it. We can have a lot of practice with it, and that's all okay. So yeah, I think I'd like invite some curiosity and sort of open-mindedness towards the practice, and say, give it a try if you haven't already. But also just consider, like how, potentially how much there can be to it, but also how little there can be to it, and to hold both of those in mind.
Well, thank all of you very much for being here. For those who are watching or listening, know that we'll have a link to that paper, which, by the way, is open access at this time. So the whole paper is there. It's not all that long. I do recommend reading through that, and there are some magnificent citations that were included with it as well. So please do check that out. We'll have links where links are found. I'd like to thank our guests. Tom, thank you so much for being here. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and all of us. It's been an absolute pleasure, Ted.
Liz, thank you so much for being here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Thanks to the listeners. It's been a real privilege.
And Masha, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, again, it has been really wonderful to discuss.
Thanks for tuning in to today's conversation. And again, special thanks to our friends for guiding us through some of the tensions that exist in mindfulness today. Our next episode will be with Dr. Allison Evans, speaking about the need for supervision for mindfulness-based intervention teachers. Spoiler alert, there's a lot to it. There's a lot there. So, until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time.